distinguished guests, it is a joy to welcome you here tonight to the Carter Centre to our event celebrating 25 years of the Good Friday Agreement. And I want to thank Paige, Jason, and all of the wonderful team at the Carter Centre for working with us to commemorate this historic achievement, which belongs to the people of Northern Ireland first and foremost, but which is also a beacon of hope the world over for those waging peace. And I want to thank every single one of you who's come out tonight, because your presence here is also an expression of solidarity with Northern Ireland and of your commitment to peace. So thank you so much for making the time. We've gathered some exceptional speakers for you this evening, not least our four panellists who've travelled all the way from Northern Ireland to be with us tonight. Brona Hines, Mike Nesbitt, Jarlath Carney and Emma Johnston. We are so grateful that you took the time to share your experiences with us here in Atlanta and in Houston, where we've come from an event at the Baker Institute. And we're particularly honoured to have with us two former US ambassadors who have made an enormous contribution to peace in Northern Ireland. Mitchell Rees, who was US Special Envoy to Northern Ireland from 2003 to 2007, and Barbara Stevenson, who was US Consul General in Belfast from 2001 to 2004. And I'm delighted to also welcome my colleague, UK Consul General Rachel Galloway. So a quarter century ago in Belfast, a rare, improbable and beautiful thing happened. A peace agreement was signed, breaking a cycle of violence that had ravaged the island of Ireland for 30 years. Between 1969 and 1998, around 3,700 lives were taken. And to get a sense of the scale of the hurt in a small place, that would be the equivalent of almost 700,000 lives lost if the population were that of the United States. Tens of thousands were injured, and many more were traumatized. And to this day, we're still learning about the intergenerational impacts of trauma. I was a teenager on Good Friday 1998, about 100 miles down the road from Belfast in the Dublin suburbs, but living in a different and much safer world than my teenage counterparts in Northern Ireland. This was the Derry Girls generation, but my whole childhood, as I got ready for school, I would hear the litany of violence on the breakfast news bulletins as the newsreaders grimly took stock of the previous night's atrocities in Northern Ireland. Car bombs, punishment beatings, kneecappings. I can remember so vividly asking my mother what that was. Shootings in bars, massacres, and as a child, it felt very close by, very present, and yet from the safety of Dublin, just 100 miles down the road, unimaginable, totally unimaginable. But thanks to the Good Friday Agreement, that scale of violence is also now unimaginable to the teenagers of today's Northern Ireland, and a whole generation has grown to adulthood without the shadow of violence. Because on the 10th of April 1998, everything changed. Through groundbreaking leadership from across the traditions of the island, from the UK and Irish governments, civil society, women's movements, and from ordinary people, a remarkable, a miraculous peace was achieved. It was endorsed overwhelmingly by the people north and south, who voted to approve the agreement and to reject the violence of the past. And there are people alive today because of that. The agreement respected and reflected the different aspirations for the future of the island and committed all to pursuing these solely through peaceful and democratic means. It recognised the complexities of identities by acknowledging that a person can be British or Irish or both, and rejected the narrow tribalism that had really trapped entire communities in false binaries. The agreement transformed utterly what we in the island of Ireland thought was possible and what we could hope for the future. And that hope, that sense of possibility, while it took root, it blossomed in Northern Ireland. It was cultivated and nurtured by the United States. I think the vital contribution of many US presidents, including President Clinton, during whose administration the peace agreement was signed, that's been extensively documented. But less well known, and I think unfairly so, is the contribution that set the stage for all succeeding US presidents. And tonight we honoured the contribution of President Jimmy Carter, who established the precedent for a strong White House role on Northern Ireland. His 1977 Carter Initiative was the first formal statement by a US president on Northern Ireland, breaking with convention to acknowledge that Northern Ireland was an international issue of concern to the White House. His principled position in the face of resistance was a foundation stone for the strong bipartisan support that became the hallmark of US engagement. And in time, that engagement came to represent the triumph of the best of US foreign policy. It was America's audacity, America's sense of possibility, that helped the parties to the agreement to aspire to a better future. And it was President Carter who woke the possible, showing the way to a better future. And we're grateful for that tonight as we mark 25 years of the Good Friday Agreement. And we're grateful that we have an opportunity to express our appreciation to President Carter. So with this short video I'm about to show you, it celebrates the contribution of the United States to the achievement of peace. And I think you might recognize some faces, including one who's here in the audience. So if you could please roll it there, Roisin, as we say in Ireland, and show the video.
On this 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, we recognise an unparalleled achievement that brought peace, thanks to leadership within Northern Ireland, the Irish and British governments, our international partners, and the enduring friendship of the United States.
Never have I felt a sense of gratification and responsibility and gratitude that I feel today.
In particular, we express our appreciation for the United States leadership and support for the process of peace and reconciliation in Northern Ireland. Relations between the island of Ireland and the US have spanned generations and political traditions and continue to grow in depth. The ongoing energy of the Irish diaspora has inspired countless US political leaders, members of Congress, advisors and diplomats to change history through their contribution to the peace process.
And so I ask you to build on the opportunity you have before you, to believe that the future can be better than the past, to work together because you have so much more to gain by working together than by drifting apart. Have the patience to work for a just and lasting peace. Reach for it. The United States will reach with you.
Today, support from the US is as important as ever, as an honest broker, friend to all sides, and supporter of the Good Friday Agreement.
As you well know, the peace agreement was the beginning, not the end.
We look forward to what we can achieve together in the next 25 years.
So I think that what I'd like to do next is ask you all if you could please give a very warm welcome to Jason Carter, lawyer and politician, chairperson of the Carter Centre and grandson of Jimmy Carter. And Jason, we're honoured to have you with us. And please, you
Thank you so much. I'm honored to welcome you here on this historic occasion. Taquiva, thank you very much for your exceptional partnership and that of the Irish government in making this event possible. Thank you to the distinguished panelists for the time to come here and to share with us on this evening. Also, thank you so much to Ambassador Rees, to everyone else, the distinguished guests that we have here. Appreciate it enormously. 25 years ago, I was a Peace Corps volunteer in South Africa. Mandela was the president, and when the Good Friday Agreement was finalized and announced, it seemed to me, living in this early days of this new South Africa and watching these other conflicts come to an end, that it was part of this real momentum toward peace globally, that there was this kinship among peacemakers across the world where folks were thinking that things were possible. And that spirit and that kinship of peacemakers, while times have changed a little bit, this Good Friday Agreement shows that seemingly irreconcilable adversaries can find pathways to peace with vision, persistence, hope, political courage, leadership from both governments and folks at the ground level. And we at the Carter Center continue to believe in that spirit. We are currently working on conflicts in Mali, Sudan, Israel and Palestine, Syria, among others. And all of those seem insolvable some days. And most recently, and for the first time, we've begun working in the United States on conflict resolution, applying the lessons that we've learned over 40 years to the divisions that we have here at home. And I'm particularly honored here tonight to welcome you to tell the story and to learn these crucial lessons of how these seemingly impossible peace in Northern Ireland emerged. We also celebrate this achievement of peacemaking at a time when we're reflecting, at least in my family, and I know for many of you who've already spoken, on my grandfather's life. And I appreciated your comments about my grandfather, and I appreciated his inclusion in the video. And I was going to take a minute to just talk briefly about the specifics of what he did, because I'm a proud grandchild, if that's okay. You mentioned the 1977 statement, and when in office, he, I think, surprised and frustrated many of his advisors with that comment. At the time, the most important ally, the UK, had maintained that this was an internal British matter, and it was crucially important for him. No previous American president had ever said almost anything about Northern Ireland as an issue of U.S. foreign policy, and when he made his historic statement, he really invited in or injected in the international community, both pledging U.S. support for a peaceful means to finding a just solution that protected human rights and guaranteed freedom from discrimination. He invited the Republic of Ireland into the discussion, which opened the door for an enormous amount of work, obviously, that was done between the Anglo-Irish Agreement of 1985 and elsewhere. But it also paved the way for the successors that have been celebrated in this video to pursue one of the best examples of U.S. foreign policy and foreign engagement. Do you remember when the U.S. exported peace? As we'll hear this evening, significant challenges, of course, remain, and as George Mitchell said at the time, that implementing the agreement would be more complicated than reaching the agreement itself, perhaps. I realize there's a lot to learn. But I also believe that the situation is summed up, perhaps, in that last episode of Dairy Girls, where the children are standing there saying, this may be like this forever, and the grandfather says, vote for it. And maybe in 25 years, you'll be able to tell your children that the world has changed. And that's where we are. And for us in the U.S., I think right now, tonight, I appreciate, as we at the Carter Center try to maintain that spirit of peace building, try to maintain that presence of that kinship among peacemakers as we confront something in this country I think that we haven't confronted perhaps before, and as we feel sometimes that we're sliding back away from that momentum towards peace in the world. It's a wonderful moment for us as Americans to have you here, to talk to us, to see us, to let us learn from you. Our democracy has moved in some ways to this kind of zero-sum identity-based politics that fueled 30 years of violence in Northern Ireland. On the first anniversary of the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol, my grandfather wrote in an op-ed, "Our great nation now teeters on the brink of a widening abyss. Without immediate action, we're at genuine risk of civil conflict and losing our precious democracy." And so tonight, it's not just an opportunity, I think, to celebrate the successes of the Good Friday Agreement, but it's a time to rekindle that spirit among all of us, that we can come together, we can achieve great things. I know there's Georgia politicians in here, Republicans and Democrats sitting in this audience who've worked together, who know what we need to do and what we can do. And so I just appreciate all of you. To the extent the U.S. was ever a beacon of hope for Northern Ireland, we appreciate that you tonight are a beacon of hope for us. So thank you very much. It's my great honor to welcome you to the Carter Center, and also to introduce British Consul General Rachel Galloway for her reflections. So thank you very much.
Good evening. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak here tonight. It's a real honour to be here with such a distinguished and expert panel. And it's a real pleasure to have the opportunity to reflect on the 25th anniversary of the Belfast, the Good Friday Agreement. It was a historic agreement, and not just for the people of Northern Ireland, but for Ireland and the whole of the United Kingdom. The Good Friday Agreement ended 30 years of armed conflict, and that will always remain its most profound and important legacy. And it is special to be marking that legacy here in the Carter Centre. President Carter has focused on advancing peace around the world, no matter what the conflict. And on all the issues that he and the Carter Centre have worked on, there's been this focus on the human rights of all the people involved in the conflict. And the Good Friday Agreement is based on guarantees of rights. It recognises the crucial birthright of all people of Northern Ireland to identify and be accepted as Irish, British, or both, and to hold one or both of those citizenships. And it's established powerful new institutions to protect those rights for the whole community. It's ensured that institutions provide inclusive decision-making and governance, representative of all communities in Northern Ireland. And it also saw the return of devolved government in Northern Ireland after nearly 30 years. And this achievement of helping to set Northern Ireland on a path to permanently ending armed conflict wasn't just delivered by Northern Ireland, United Kingdom and Ireland. It was delivered with the help of our friends, as we've said, the United States, but also with the work of Finland, South Africa, Canada and many others. And also, standing here today, we can say that just because the agreement's been in place for 25 years, it doesn't mean that the work is done. And the United Kingdom government has continually supported and invested in Northern Ireland, its place in the Union, and the Good Friday Agreement framework itself. And we are committed to making it better still. So we've put in place the Windsor framework to ensure that the provisions meet the people of Northern Ireland's needs now, that the people of Northern Ireland have a veto over new laws through the Stormont break. Our first two speakers reflected on where they were 25 years ago. So I actually have a memory that is from 1996. I was working on a kibbutz in Israel, and someone asked me if I'd heard about the bomb. And I thought, Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and they said Manchester, which is where I'm from in the north of England. And it was just sort of bringing it home once again that this conflict was on our doorsteps. And now, 25 years later, what am I doing in this job? Last month, I brought a trade delegation here from Northern Ireland, representing this dynamic economy, this world-leading film industry, Game of Thrones, Northmen, to give a few examples, fintech, cybersecurity, engineering sectors. Like Atlanta, Belfast is now one of the top 25 tech cities in the world. This was felt unthinkable 25 years ago when this was being put in place. And then I'd just like to say, as I am here in the Carter Centre, it would really be wrong not to mention the work of civil society, of community organisations, of faith groups, and of individuals who've worked to foster reconciliation, respect, and mutual understanding in the journey to the agreement, but also in the 25 years since. To mention the sometimes forgotten role of women in the peace process. To mention those who are now working to educate young people on what has happened and what we can do to build a shared, brighter future. And I think events like these are part of that education. So I just want to thank you all for including me in this event. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel, for those lovely remarks. Really, thank you. Next, we're honoured to hear from former US Ambassador Mitchell Rees. Ambassador Rees was Director of Policy Planning at the US Department of State from 2003 to 2005 and concurrently served as the US Special Envoy for Northern Ireland from 2003 to 2007 during the presidency of George W. Bush. And in that capacity, he was tasked with supporting the implementation of the agreement. So, Ambassador, if you'd join us, we are looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I want to thank the Consulate of Ireland, the Consul General, her team, and also everybody at the Carter Center for giving me this great honor this evening. It's especially meaningful for me to be here. This is my first time at the Carter Center. My very first job in the US government was a summer intern in President Carter's White House. My role in helping national security was to play tennis with the National Security Advisor every morning on the White House tennis court and, give him a good workout every day. And I think that really has gone unrecognized for many years. I want to start by explaining a little bit on how I was selected for the position of Special Envoy in 2003. As the Consul General mentioned, I was the Director of Policy Planning at the State Department. My responsibilities were to provide Secretary Powell with specific recommendations on all the key challenges around the world, whether it's Asia, the Middle East, Russia, Africa, Latin America. And he called me into his office to be interviewed for this position. Now, I had worked for him previously when he was National Security Advisor for Ronald Reagan. And he knew that I had spent 4 years negotiating with the North Koreans on their nuclear weapons program. And he asked me if I wanted the job. And I said, yes, I do. And then he asked me, I think with a twinkle in his eye, why I thought I was qualified for the job. And I said, I grew up in Boston. And he understood that it had a strong Irish community. And he said, that sounds about right. And that was the extent of the interview. And so for the next 4 years, I reported to the Secretary and also directly to President George W. Bush, trying to implement the terms of the Good Friday Agreement. Yes, it was an agreement, but the devil was in the details on how the terms would be interpreted and especially how they would be implemented. And as we've heard, Senator Mitchell just a few weeks ago said he thought that the implementation would be at least as difficult and challenging as the negotiation itself. Now, a key issue at the time, perhaps the key issue for many of the participants, was policing and justice. Specifically, all the political parties needed to commit publicly to endorsing the policing and justice systems in Northern Ireland especially Sinn Féin because of its connections with the IRA. We all know that they did so eventually. But how did this happen? It's really a tale of two stories. The first story starts in 1922, when the Royal Ulster Constabulary began. Traditionally, it was overwhelmingly a Protestant police force. Far greater than 90% of the officers were Protestant. And I think it was one reason why David Trimble, in his Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech, described Northern Ireland as a cold house for Catholics. Now, during the Troubles, the RUC was accused of police brutality in collusion with the loyalist paramilitary groups. At the same time, 319 RUC officers were killed during the Troubles, and almost 9,000 were wounded. It was the most perilous police force on which to serve anywhere in the world during these decades. Now, in 2001, the RUC was superseded by the Police Service of Northern Ireland, the PSNI, which was based on recommendations for a fresh start for police reform by a commission headed by Christopher Patten. Now, the Patten Commission intended the PSNI to be far more integrated than the RUC, ideally 50% Catholic, 50% Protestant. It institutionalized personnel exchanges with the police force, the Garda Síochána, in the south. And it made sure that it was supervised by a policing board with an ombudsman to investigate all complaints. Now, significantly, and eventually, the PSNI was endorsed by all the political parties, including Sinn Féin. Now, like all police services anywhere in the world, it has challenges, but polling data shows that it has enjoyed, and today enjoys, widespread support from the public. So this was the public narrative. But what happened behind the scenes? That story also starts in 1998 with the Good Friday Agreement. And we know that it took another 9 years for the IRA to eventually decommission its weapons and for Sinn Féin to endorse the policing and justice systems. Now, these were the bedrock demands in particular of the Unionists. It was absolutely essential if they were ever to join with Sinn Féin and enter the Stormont Assembly together. The leader of the DUP at that time that I was dealing with, both Ian Paisley, but especially Peter Robinson, told me that it was a non-starter unless Sinn Féin publicly endorsed policing and justice. But if they did, then he would be willing to do the deal. Well, just by asking Sinn Féin to do so was not really going to be terribly effective. But something happened in early 2005. There was a turning point with the unlikely murder of Robert McCartney outside a pub in Belfast, and the subsequent cover-up by the IRA, who dispatched a team to the pub to wipe all the forensic evidence and seize the CCTV cameras, and also to intimidate all the witnesses from bearing witness against the murderers. Now, Robert McCartney had 5 sisters and a partner, all very attractive young Catholic women from the Short Strand, an area of Belfast that supported Sinn Féin. Unlike past incidents when this type of thing would happen, the sisters bravely called on Sinn Féin and the IRA to produce the murderers so that they could have justice for their brother. In response, they were threatened, both publicly and privately. Now, I invited the McCartney sisters to Washington, D.C. a few weeks later to celebrate the Good Friday Agreement, to celebrate St. Patrick's Day in March. The sisters took Washington, D.C. by storm, and they spoke about ending the IRA's vigilante justice in Catholic communities, and they won over Irish America. A few days after meeting them, Senator John McCain, speaking before the America-Ireland Fund Gala with the good and the great of Irish America in the audience, called the IRA a bunch of cowards, with Jerry Adams sitting in the front row. 3 weeks later, Adams called for the IRA to decommission its weapons. 3 months later, the IRA publicly agreed to do so. 18 months later, Sinn Féin endorsed policing and justice. Again, one of the last unionist demands, and that led to the standing up of the Stormont Assembly in May 2007, with a famous picture of Ian Paisley and Martin McGuinness standing side by side. Now, celebrating the success of the PSNI was one reason I was in Belfast last month, along with President Biden, President Clinton, Secretary Clinton, Prime Ministers Tony Blair, Bertie Ahern, and many, many other people who were instrumental in bringing peace to Northern Ireland. It was a very special moment, looking back over the last 25 years since the Good Friday Agreement. And it was also a chance to look ahead and assess some of the remaining challenges that still are holding Northern Ireland back from realizing its full potential and the full promise of the Good Friday Agreement. Now, for me, the top three remaining challenges are, first, the continued existence of the loyalist paramilitary groups. 7 years ago, the UK government invited me to come back and help them join a commission to recommend ways in which to end paramilitary violence in the paramilitary groups in Northern Ireland. We've been at it for 7 years. We're still at it. Our work isn't done yet. The second challenge is the lack of integrated education in Northern Ireland. 25 years ago, the percentage of children in integrated schools was in the single digits. Sadly, 25 years on, it is still in the single digits. This is not a way to build a better future for Northern Ireland, and I think people are now recognizing that. The third challenge is related to the lack of integrated education, and that's a lack of integrated housing. Unless people can live together, go to school together, and work together, you're not going to build the Northern Ireland that everybody, at least that I talk to, wants. Now, many people that we know are working very hard every day in their communities to try to overcome these challenges and many others. And I'm confident that Northern Ireland will overcome them. And as they work to do so, I'm also confident that America, both Republicans and Democrats on a bipartisan basis, as we've always done, will be with you to help. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mitchell. I'm glad we corrected the record on the tennis. That was worth it for that alone. We're going to move to the panel stage of the evening, and I'd like to invite to the stage now our panellists and our moderator. And first, let me just say that we have a very special moderator for our conversation tonight, someone whose personal commitment to Northern Ireland is so deep, so passionate. Like so many US public servants, and you've just heard from Ambassador Rees, who've worked on these issues, it is so meaningful to them, and we're humbled, as Mike said earlier, by their devotion, nothing less than devotion. I'd like to invite Barbara Stevenson, now Vice Provost for Global Affairs at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, who served, as I said earlier, as US Consul General in Belfast from 2001 to 2004, a really critical period for Northern Ireland, and also a time of transition from the Clinton to the Bush administrations. And Ambassador Stevenson has had a very distinguished career in the State Department, including as Ambassador to Panama, also Chargé d'Affaires and Deputy Ambassador in London. So she's got an excellent insight into the Netflix series, The Diplomat, also. We'll get into that later. And our panellists, Brona Hines, a founder of the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition, a negotiator of the Good Friday Agreement, and someone who has spent her life working for peace, including supporting women all over the world to engage in peace processes. We also have Mike Nesbitt, a four-time elected MLA who served as leader of the Ulster Unionist Party from 2012 to 2017. He's now UUP spokesman on the economy and policing and a fierce advocate for the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. Before entering politics, he was a prominent broadcast journalist in Northern Ireland. Emma Johnston is a youth worker with Youth Action Northern Ireland who is in the community day in, day out, working to overcome the legacies of the Troubles with young people and helping them to aspire to a thriving Northern Ireland. And we have Jarlath Carney, a former political correspondent who went on to serve as advisor to Sinn Féin's ministers in the Northern Ireland Executive. He then left party politics and entered the public service and serves as an Equality Commissioner, a parole commissioner, and has also worked extensively in the Western Balkans on democratic reform projects. So if you could give them all a warm round of applause, Boulabus, and over to you.
I want to first just say what an honor it is to have been invited to moderate this panel. As the Consul General said, I've got a deep commitment to the Northern Ireland peace process, and the people of Northern Ireland have got a deep place in my heart. I also want to say how special it is to be at the Carter Center. I've heard about it all my life. I've always wanted to be here, and we think of President Carter as that president who put human rights at the very heart of American foreign policy. And I came into the American Foreign Service in 1985, just 4 years after the president left office. And I was one of that first generation of political officers who started out writing human rights reports, mine on Panama, and then my next one was editing the one for the United Kingdom in 1992, which everybody said, oh, that'll be easy, but I had to remind them Jerry Adams at the time was not allowed to be heard on BBC. His voice was played by an actor. So the idea that human rights would be at the very center of our foreign policy, it wasn't just an idea President Carter had. I'm part of a generation of American diplomats who grew up writing those human rights reports and putting human rights at the center of all these questions. So it is wonderful to be here celebrating this landmark achievement of 25 years of peace. And really, I can't think of a better place to be. I did get to serve as Consul General in Belfast with Mitchell Reese as my envoy. It was wonderful. We worked on turning the RUC into the PSNI and supporting it every step of the way. And like Mitchell, I was back in Belfast for the 25th anniversary of the peace agreement. And it was wonderful. As he said, it was prime ministers, it was all these old friends. It was just a wonderful time. But when I'm asked what I think was most special about it, it was the young people I met at the dinner at Hillsborough Castle who are, like Emma, youth activists, and they said to me, you know, we're peace babies. We grew up with no memory whatsoever of any violence, and I thought, okay, whatever's still left to be done, let us celebrate the achievement that there are these wonderful young adults standing here before us who have no memory whatsoever of violence in Northern Ireland. So that was the highlight for me. The panel tonight is going to answer two structured questions that they have been told what they are, and they've had a chance to prepare their remarks. So the first one will be a look back question at the Good Friday Agreement, and then the second round will be a looking forward question about what's next. Then we want to have a few minutes of discussion among the panel, and then we hope for a good 10 to 15 minutes, although we're a little bit behind schedule here, but we're going to have audience questions. So that's how it will unfold. So I'm going to start, and we're going to go in the order that we're lined up, because that's how we practice this. So the first question for the panelists is this. I'm going to ask each of you to give opening remarks, offering reflections on the peace agreement reached 25 years ago. Such successes are all too rare, so any broad lessons that you want to share on how to build peace and nourish dialogue would be most welcome. And I'd also like to ask each of you to offer your perspective on the impact of the U.S. role in the Northern Ireland peace process. I don't think there's any concealing what a source of pride it is for us to have been part of it. So I'm going to go first to Brona.
Good evening, everyone, and it's such a pleasure to be here. Shortly after we agreed the peace agreement, the U.S. State Department was good enough to offer me an individual visit to the United States. And the one thing that was on my itinerary was to come to visit the Carter Center then. So I am delighted to be back now. And I think starting from that point where Jimmy Carter elevated Northern Ireland, which was a tiny region, into a matter of international concern is an extremely important lesson to learn. And in those days, there were 3 leading conflicts that everyone's attention was on: South Africa, the Middle East, the Israeli-Palestine issue, and Northern Ireland. And Northern Ireland was such a small area, it was amazing to have that attention to us, and the investment that the US has put in from Barbara and Mitchell, through the Clintons, through President Carter, and many, many more, has been vast. In terms of reflecting on the agreement, what did it teach us? Well, first of all, it taught us that the pathfinders and the peace builders were working for decades before. They weren't necessarily the politicians in the room. They were the community activists in rural and urban areas, the relationship builders, the people who were working across the communities, the women's groups, the youth groups, working to try and build some kind of sense in their lives, to reflect communities, and to build some kind of peace and reconciliation. So that would be one lesson. The second lesson was, because we had had a failed process before, was that the process was inclusive. For the first time, instead of trying to glue together parties designated as being in the middle, we had an electoral process to bring a range of stakeholders into the room. In fact, it was to, if you like, bless with a democratic mandate political wings of those who carried guns, but it was something that we used as women to get a route to the table, and it did increase greater diversity. Reflecting back, I would also say that the policing service, which Mitchell has referred to, is one of the great successes of the agreement, and nobody actually held out hope that it would be such at the time. But to actually do policing from a sectarian police force into a much more integrated service on a human rights framework, policing with the community, was an amazing achievement. And I have to say, one of the lessons that we learned from the US, which informed our type of governance, is the bipartisan approach that you can see reflected in the power-sharing nature of our governance. Now, we can talk about what has worked and what hasn't worked, and it's been up and down and up and down. But we are not going back to violence. Senator Mitchell established the principles of nonviolence, which is very clear, comes from areas like Atlanta, Martin Luther King Center, and we looked at those principles again this morning. So establishing the principles of nonviolence and negotiated settlement forward, and a bipartisan approach to partnership and to government, we have some lessons and some way to go in terms of delivering collectively for the people and in holding our politicians, like Mike, to account for doing that. I'll leave it there.
Perfect. Mike, your thoughts?
Well, Ambassador, I want to start by thanking you, not just for moderating, and indeed not just for your service. I want to thank you and Ambassador Rees for sticking with us, because it's personal. I feel it intellectually and emotionally. You've stuck with us, and we are so grateful for you. I would say American involvement has been extraordinary, exceptional, and actually I'm going to argue it has been essential to get us to where we are today. So if I may, I'm going to start with 1994 for a personal reason. And in 1994, the total number of visits by serving US presidents to Northern Ireland remained at 0. Today, we have an almost unbroken run from Bill Clinton to Joe Biden, with just one exception. Now, if you bear in mind, Belfast has a population of only about 330,000 people. How many American cities are regularly visited by their president? It's an amazing commitment. And it's not just at a high level. In '94 was the first time I saw the bipartisan approach of Representatives Richie Neal and Pete King. And they were still at it 5 years ago with the 20th anniversary, and I have to say it was one of the honors of my political life to be asked to speak at the event at the Library of Congress. And then, of course, there's the most important American of all, Senator George Mitchell. And if you didn't yet catch his address in Belfast on the 17th of April, I really encourage you to do so. If a 40-year-old in good health had made that speech, you would be out of your seats clapping. An 89-year-old man with acute leukemia was making a valedictory remark. I will never hear a better speech. It wasn't just a speech, it was a poem, and it was a plea to keep on going. So as we celebrate what happened on the 10th of April 1998, I also want to recall an event that happened on this side of the pond on the 1st of February 1994. The National Committee on American Foreign Policy wanted to have a conference on Northern Ireland featuring the leaders of the 5 Northern Ireland parties. And they got 4 leaders signed up, but they had a problem with Gerry Adams, who was president or Uachtaráin of Sinn Féin. He needed a visa, and President Clinton went against the advice of very powerful bodies like his own State Department and the UK government to give him a visa limited by geography and time, 48 hours in New York. I covered that conference as you would call it, a news anchor for Ulster Television. And when it was over, Mr. Adams stood in the center of the reception area, surrounded by nearly 40 TV crews, like rings of an onion. But in the corner, watching on his own, cigarette in hand, was John Hume, leader of the SDLP, who had spent over 25 years on a solo run back and forth to America, generating interest in our affairs. The 4 horsemen, Kennedy, Tip O'Neill, Kerry, Moynihan. And in that moment, it was clear he was virtually handing the baton over to Sinn Féin, who were political opponents because the 2 parties swim in the same sea for votes. So if you're looking for an act of leadership defined by putting the needs of the people above your party political instincts, you will never see finer. And we saw it again on the 10th of April, 98, when he and David Trimble again said, the interests of the people must come first. And a final thought, if I may, Ambassador, was the other thing about the conference in 94 was when Gerry Adams got the visa, the unionist leaders did 2 things. Jim Molyneux and Ian Paisley, first of all, withdrew from the conference. And then in an act which I would consider to be utter madness, they cancelled their flights. Who on earth did they think was going to put unionism's case for them? And then, to add a certain insult to injury, they accused America of being biased and pro-Irish nationalism. Well, it seems to me in the human condition, if you only hear one side of a story, you tend to go with it, but you also then tend to be curious about hearing the other side of the story. And that's why I'm so pleased to be here tonight, and while I will never refuse an invitation to come to this great country and try and make sure that all views and sides are represented, because I know this from my time coming backwards and forwards, if you ask for hearing, you get a fair one. So thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you. We can look at the situation in Northern Ireland through a range of prisms, historical, political, colonial, emotional. If we look at it through the rational prism, the rational question that the Good Friday Agreement asked and answered is, how do we, as people on the same piece of earth, coexist in a sustainable way? And the agreement put at its heart, in that respect, equality and human rights. So I think the American involvement has been both institutional, and we've heard that from Ambassador Rees, but it's also been inspirational. In 1988, I was 15. The 4th of April 1988 was Easter Monday. It was the 20th anniversary of the assassination, the murder of Dr. Martin Luther King. And at that time in our house in Antrim, we had a 16-inch portable colour television, and we had an old second-hand top-loader VHS recorder. And on that day, I recorded a program that I still have on DVD and that I watched before I came here, which is called In Remembrance of Martin. And that opened with then Mayor, Ambassador Andy Young, talking about the importance of an individual, the importance of leadership in changing society. In the previous month, the conflict related to Northern Ireland had seen 3 IRA operatives killed by the SAS unarmed in Gibraltar. It had seen their funerals then attacked by a loyalist in Milltown Cemetery in Belfast. One of the funerals from that attack then led to a situation where civilian-dressed British Army officers were attacked and killed in Andersonstown. And a Catholic priest called Father Alec Reid gave those soldiers the last rites. He gave them the kiss of life. He tried to prevent their murders. And in his pocket, he had a document related to the emerging peace process, with the envelope later stained with the blood of one of the soldiers. The situation in Northern Ireland was so difficult at that stage that it needed leaders to stand up. Leaders like Alec Reid, quietly, but also leaders like John Hume, leaders like Inez McCormick, and the battle for fair employment as a key stabiliser of the society in Northern Ireland saw a range of ultimately bipartisan and successful elements coming together. It saw the McBride principles here in the United States, where you had people from various spectrums, from Tom Hayden at one side to Peter King at the other. It saw the UK government introducing new legislation. It saw President Clinton bringing into federal law the McBride principles around the International Fund for Ireland, which had been introduced by President Reagan. And fair employment is one of the success stories, not just of that period, but the period since. In the last couple of weeks, the Equality Commission for Northern Ireland, on which I sit, and which was formed under the agreement, produced its 32nd annual monitoring report of the public workforce, public and private workforce. Parity is now achieved between Protestants and Catholics. Fair participation is achieved in the public workforce. That has led almost organically to people starting to work together and then socialise together and then live together and ultimately have their children brought up in the same areas and society. So reconciliation is one of those issues on which the institutional and inspirational involvement of America has been very, very important. And the final point is this. The agreement worked because a strategy of process was put in place, a process around which Brona and Mike have talked, where inclusion was at the core of it. We now need to move towards a process of strategy that takes us into the next phase, and that has to have reconciliation, rights, and respect at the core.
Thank you, Jarlath. And Emma?
Yeah, hi everybody, and thank you so much, Ambassador, for having me, and to everybody here tonight in Cueva and all the team. I was told to start my presentation by saying that I went to the school that Derry Girls is about, Claim to Fame, and I have to say it actually does replicate a lot of what we went through as teenagers. So I was Cueva's. For this question, I can only talk about my lived experience because I wasn't a youth worker then, I was too young to even be working. But I was Cueva's counterpart as a teenager growing up in Northern Ireland in the 90s. So I suppose for me, I didn't come from, I lived, it's interesting what the Ambassador Rees was chatting about because I did grow up in an integrated community, which I was very, very blessed to be. And I did come across people from a Protestant background growing up as a Catholic. I would say that my family, the most sectarian person in my family, sorry to say this, Granny, God bless you, was probably my grandmother. And she didn't say anything too bad, but I remember on the 12th of July, the day where the marching season would happen, that she would always say, wouldn't you know they would get a good drying day? Because the sun was always shining. But I do remember always getting bundled into the car. Living in Derry, we were on a border, so we were right beside Donegal. So I always remember getting bundled into the car, 6 kids. We're Irish Catholic, remember? And just a pile of egg and onion sandwiches. And I remember we had to get off-site because our little city was overtook that day by the bands and cars and all of those things. But I suppose for me, the lesson that I learned was a really important one, because full disclaimer, I was a child of the first peace monies to enter Northern Ireland, and this demonstrates how investment and funding and people really works. So when I started the group, it was called the Right to Hope, and it was a cross-border throughout Northern Ireland, the cross-border counties, and we were a group of Protestants and Catholics, and we thought we were class because we called ourselves the Derry Londonderry group. So Derry has a lot of politics behind our name, so mostly people from the Catholic background say Derry, Protestant background say Londonderry, so we were the Derry Londonderry group, so we were quite cool. But we got to work together using nurture and dialogue to unpick what was going on. So when we saw the soldiers on the streets at the checkpoints, or what were we going through, what did that mean, what did we care about, and we got to go on 5-day residentials once a year with young people from all the border counties and all the counties of Northern Ireland, and we did incredible work. We got to meet with young people from other countries who were going through conflict, from the Africa, from the US. We got to take part in workshops, and really inform recommendations about how Northern Ireland could work well for the young people of Northern Ireland. And I suppose for me, that's why I'm sitting here today as a youth activist and also as a youth worker, because I recognised that there was another way to learn, that we don't have to sit in a classroom and be taught by one person, that we all have so much to learn from each other. And I suppose for me, that lesson shows that dedicating funding and investment to good relations and reconciliation works, because it's the reason why I'm here. So thanks. And I wanted to come to the US too.
Thank you so much, Emma. I love this second question. Quiva helped frame this, and it unleashes the most wonderful energy you'll see when I ask it. Starting with the same order with Brona. Tell us, what does a thriving Northern Ireland look like, and how do we get there?
Well, how we get there is the million-dollar question. Actually, it would be really good if we had an implementation plan. It was one of the things I think was a step that we couldn't get to within the negotiations. We didn't have an implementation plan. I think two of the things we gave to the world of negotiation was, one of them coined by John Hume, was nothing is agreed until everything is agreed, so that everybody felt secure, that people could bank things and weren't giving away something until they also saw themselves reflected in the agreement. And the other thing was constructive ambiguity. And sometimes we had a bit too much constructive ambiguity. I might draw back a little on this. But I do remember in the final days of the negotiations, Monica was saying to me, hurry up, I was working on another paper that we were going to put. And that paper was about selling the agreement collectively. If we were to sign up to it, there were 10 parties in the negotiations. 2 of those parties were in the negotiations in order to not support them, and they finally walked away. But the rest of the 8 of us, right across from one side of the community to the other, were working to try and find a solution. And we as the Women's Coalition tried to get people to sign up to selling a common message together, but that was a step too far. And I suppose that was a mini implementation, but not quite an implementation plan. So I think we really, at this stage, with the executive going up and down, I think we need an implementation plan. The second thing I'd like to say is, and I'm very pleased to see it with the current Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, is what has happened, and Rachel referred to it, around the Windsor Framework. It was completely devastating to us in Northern Ireland. We voted against leaving the European Union, but it was devastating to us in so many ways. But let me just put 2. Number 1, well, there's 3. 1, it changed the notion of identity for us. It moved us outside our narrow framework of looking at Protestant, Catholic, nationalist, unionist identity into a European framing of identity, and particularly for young people who could take advantage of Erasmus and student programs abroad and widened horizons. So that was number 1. The second issue, which was extremely difficult, and Jarlath has referred to it, is equality and human rights was a fault line in the conflict. and in many conflicts, it is a front line, because if you want to maintain yourself in power, what you do is discriminate against others in order to keep a grasp on power. And actually what we know that does in conflicts is make the situation worse, and it gradually explodes out of control. So actually that thing about rights is incredibly important, and equal respect. And what it did for us in the European Union is it made us in Northern Ireland look beyond Northern Ireland, try to remove equality and human rights as a political football into the people's eyes on the European Union, the European Court of Justice, the European Convention, and beyond that to the United Nations principles, which was extremely important. And the third element is, because it's a territorial issue, it was about border. When we were in the European Union, borders dissolved, and that no longer became a point of conflict and discussion all the time in Northern Ireland. And so in a vision looking forward, I'm setting that frame because in a vision looking forward, we need to take that into account. When Ireland and the UK joined the European Union together, because it's not just the parties who were not friends, the British and Irish governments, because it's a conflict over Ireland and Britain being in Ireland, had to create a friendship and a relationship, and the European Union framework allowed that to happen, to operate as member states, so that those governments gradually came through a series of agreements to work together as member states with a responsibility to find a solution in Northern Ireland and move off backing either side to actually encouraging either side to come to our collective agreement. And I think what has been really positive now is the rebuilding of that relationship, which I think is beginning to happen, and that's really essential moving forward. Within that, we then have to rebuild what we have lost in terms of moving forward with the Brexit project that belongs to Britain, and we have the saving of that within the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. And it's around the equality and rights agenda, parallel rights, north and south. And so the rights in the south will be to European and international standards, and therefore we can use that mechanism to ensure that broadness is there. And the second thing, I think, looking forward, and I know unionists agree, because I've talked to people in the Ulster Unionist Party about this as well, is that building on some of the institutional arrangements around the agreement in terms of the north-south bodies, in terms of investing in the economic and social development of the island of Ireland. We have 6 north-south bodies around waterways, around a range of other things, but we could actually build more of those, another 6 perhaps in the next 10 years, and start investing in the economic development of the whole island. The last thing I want to make a plea for is this, and where I started, is the social agenda and the civil society actors, some of whom are business leaders, and we need business-to-business contact. But also, a lot of the Northern Ireland civil society, what we call the non-governmental organisations, were actually leading players in the development of the social dimension in Europe. And it's really important that they are also invested in to lead our next element is to actually push forward the reconciliation agenda, push forward what Mitchell has said, because I absolutely agree with him in those 3 challenges. We need to deal with the embedded paramilitarism that still lives in certain communities, particularly in loyalist and unionist communities. We need to build the capacity to stand up from that, to work with the policing and communities also to say to people, we don't want this anymore, and run campaigns to remove the coercive control, and to enable our society to move more towards integrating mixed housing and more opportunities for integrated education. And I think that's really important. And leading that will be the community and voluntary sector.
Thank you, Brona. Mike, what does a thriving Northern Ireland look like?
It looks like a prosperous one. So I think if the last 25 years were about cementing the peace, the next 25 years must be about delivering prosperity. And you will remember in 1998 there was a kind of a buzz phrase, the peace dividend, which was a reference to the fact if we're no longer spending millions and millions of pounds on security measures, this will free up money to invest in the economy. But unfortunately, thousands, far too many people haven't had a sniff of that peace dividend. So I'm hoping to do two major things in my remaining time in politics. And one is economic in terms of prosperity. And it is particularly to address the shocking number of people in Northern Ireland who are economically inactive. These are people who, unlike us, are waking up in the morning without something to do, without a good reason to get out of bed, the way we get out of bed because we have worthwhile things to do. So I want them to have the reason to get out of bed being a worthwhile job. I want them to be earning good money, having their children well educated together, to be enjoying a standard of living and a quality of life that they really cherish, because I think that will be transformational for society. And you know, a lot of people quote on occasions like this, Heaney, I'm going to reference an English writer, Charles Dickens, who talked about memorable days. And he meant by that a day that shapes the rest of your life. The analogy he used was it will wrap you in a chain. If you're lucky, it'll be a chain of gold. But if you're not, it'll be a chain of thorns. And the legacy of our conflict is that thousands and thousands have been wrapped in chains of thorns. And unfortunately, it goes down intergenerationally. And those chains are now being worn not just by children and not just grandchildren, but great-grandchildren. And we have to break that cycle. And the economy has a very important role to play in doing that. And the second thing is something that Mitchell referred to, which is to get rid once and for all of these loyalist groups. You can call them paramilitary because that's how they structure themselves, but their intent is to terrorize their community. And they've now morphed into organized criminal gangs, drug dealers, drug gangs. And they're about the business of lining their own pockets, intimidation, and coercive control of their communities. And nobody wants them anymore. But I understand that some of them do want to transition. And if they want to use their energy and commitment for the benefit of their community, I think we as politicians have a duty to create a pathway for them to do that. And pathway is not a euphemism for money, not a penny would I want to give them, but certainly create the means for them to transition and stop doing what they're doing. But there are those who will never stop doing what they're doing. For them, there has to be a proportionate and appropriate response, which will include policing and security. And I will work, Mitchell does great work on the IRC, the Independent Reporting Commission, and I really admire the work that he does, and I thank him for it, and I look forward to working with him to try and achieve that. And if I can make any contribution to those two things in my remaining time, whatever that may be, that'll make it worthwhile.
Thank you so much. Jarlath, your vision, a thriving Northern Ireland.
I would like to deal with it at two levels. One, the local, and then the global, because I don't think that you can disentangle the two. I think at the local level of Northern Ireland, I would like to see, in a utopian way, reconciliation, rights and respect embedded. But we need to have the tools and the talent to be able to do that in a structured fashion. And that's where especially US involvement comes in the time ahead, particularly around investment, touching on some of the points that colleagues have made, and also the lessons that I was drawing out in relation to fair employment. That when you have monitoring, when you have objectives, when you have policy guidelines in place to lead society in a certain direction, then you can get certain outcomes. And Ambassador Rees did it very specifically in relation to policing. We now need to do it in relation to patterns of poverty. And I would like to see US involvement which brings finance with fairness, so that as US investment starts to recoup from its involvement in Northern Ireland, we also find ways of putting in place the policy mechanisms that bring the most excluded people into the room of prosperity. So I would like to see that happen. I'd like to see a Northern Ireland that is relaxed enough to be able to engage in a conversation about what the UK's and Ireland's constitutional evolution is going to look like. I don't believe there is going to be constitutional revolution on either island. I do think that evolution is a natural element of human development. So back to the question about the agreement, it's about the rational way that we organise ourselves for sustainable coexistence. We're going to have that conversation. So I would like to see a Northern Ireland where we can have those conversations in the knowledge that this is 1 and 2 generations of a conversation ahead. And that could be an interesting conversation and one which may throw up lots of issues, ideas and opportunities that we haven't yet seen. Secondly, in relation to the global, I would, going back to my first point about the inspirational nature of US involvement, I would like to see Northern Ireland and key leaders from Northern Ireland being the inspiration for other difficult areas of the world and leading through their example of experience in helping those areas, not in a way that you come to us to get lessons. It's not about that. I've worked with Consul Galloway as ambassador when she was in Macedonia. It's about giving as much assistance as we can from really quite an intense generation of experience. And at a higher level then, I would like to see Northern Ireland as part, under the Good Friday Agreement, of the linchpin of renewed UK, Ireland and US relationships. And I think that that's already started. But geopolitically, it could be critical. I think in the time ahead, we're looking at significant disruption from the Baltics to the Balkans on Europe's eastern border. We're looking at significant issues of displacement, war, famine, torture, creating population movement from Africa. We're looking at the role of China in the world and how it relates to both the US, but also the broader global economy through BRICS. And we're looking at the relationship increasingly between national security interests and human security interests. The role of Northern Ireland, the lessons of the Good Friday Agreement, the approach of the 2 governments walking in lockstep in the time ahead with US involvement critical to that, I think could provide a leadership voice of stability and strength for mainland Europe in the time ahead. Germany, Italy, France are all facing very existential social difficulties, similar to that which is going on within the US at the minute. And the counterintuitive vision that lies ahead is that the UK and Ireland and the US, as partners now in a post-Brexit world, could potentially provide a voice of leadership and stability, not just for Europe, but for the world. So I would like to see Northern Ireland fit within that. Thank you.
Lovely. And Emma, bring us home.
Well, for me, I want the people of Northern Ireland and young people just to feel really safe, to feel free, to feel liberated, to live their life whatever way they choose. The Good Friday Agreement had its place, but it really does need to be adapted because there's so much more to our identities than just the religion that we're born with. You know, and we're lovely and we're compassionate and we want change and, you know, we have diverse backgrounds and we have hopes and dreams and aspirations, and we're not leaving space to talk about that because we're so dragged down by the political institutions. We need them to get back together. We need to have progressive politics. We need to have role models to look up to, leadership that we can connect with, rather than being told how we should be or what we should think and all those different things. Integrated education is vital moving forward. We need children and young people to coexist together, and that's pivotal. We need to educate. We talk a lot about young people being the future, and we want to pass them the mic. But in order to pass them the mic of leadership, we need to educate them to feel that they have the confidence to do so. So for me, we need to look at the lessons of the past and what it meant, but also look forward and support them to build the vision of hope and the vision of our future. And to finish, I think, I always talk about the 3 C's for young people. We need to work in collaboration. Like we belong to this planet, never mind Northern Ireland. And we need to pick our heads up sometimes and stop being stuck and think about how can we collaboratively work together. And that's where the magic happens. I believe we need to build critical thinkers in young people. See, with the age of social media, a lot of young people have lost their independent minds. They hear people online saying things and influencers, and we really need to build them to challenge the status quo. Like, surely that's what our inspirational leaders did years ago. We need them out and like having a voice and being really confident in doing that. And then the last C, which I asked Mike to bring up whenever Stormont does get together, is about compassion and compassionate leadership. We are all in this room bringing to any space our own backpacks and our own lived experiences. And it's about recognizing that leadership that's compassionate speaks to the needs of everybody and not just one group of people. So thank you.
Wasn't it great to have Emma be the final speaker? I'm going to take that round of applause for the whole panel because they did a terrific job. We're going to open it up to audience questions now. There are mics on both sides, so if you would like to ask a question of the panel, please make your way up and we'll take your question. Do you want to come to the mic? That way everybody will hear you. Thank you. We'll start here, then we'll go to you, sir.
Thank you for the opportunity. I grew up in Cavan. Anyway, I just recently learned about the wall in Belfast. And was that built after the peace agreement? I was really surprised to hear about it. And
the peace walls.
Yeah, what role does it have?
Yes, ma'am. Who would like to talk about peace walls? Bruna, do you want to do
it? I mean, one of the things I was going to say what we should mark is that after decades and decades and decades of discrimination, and Jarlath has talked about how that has been turned around, and then decades and decades of violence, the longest running conflict in Europe. And when you used to go in, we used to have rings of steel and peace walls and metal fences all around the city centre and between communities, and you had to go through those little gates that you get into, and you put your hands up, and somebody searched you sometimes, and soldiers standing around with guns everywhere. So a lot of that has changed. And some of those peace walls that went up during the conflict are still there. And what is not terribly unusual after a conflict, that sometimes things get a little worse before they get better, and we actually have more peace walls, so more walls after the conflict than we had before it. So people have them because they feel secure, but that is one of the things that we really need to address moving forward, because those walls need to come down.
Mike?
Yeah, there are more walls now than there were in 1998, and there was a policy put together to say we were going to get rid of the peace walls over a 10-year period, which seemed to be a reasonable amount of time. That policy was 2013. So it's 10 years on, and it hasn't worked. And I was involved in some discussions after the policy in North and West Belfast, and those who lived with the walls like out their back door still wanted them there because they gave them a sense of comfort and security. And they were really worried that politicians were going to say to people who lived maybe a quarter of a mile away, round a corner, who couldn't even see the walls, the same vote and the same voice in bringing the walls down as they had. So there's been a political failure in terms of addressing those walls. And to get them down, it's not about the physical structures, it's about the barriers in the mind, as John Hume used to say. And just on another topic, if I may, because I think it's really important. Since 1998, there have been more suicides in Northern Ireland than conflict-related deaths over the 30 years, by about a figure of 1,000 more suicides than conflict-related killings. And that's something else that we have to, the mental health legacy of the conflict is shocking and needs addressed.
Shall we take the next question, sir?
Yes, I'm from Dublin, so I, like the others, saw it from the south, how things were happening. But reading all the articles that were written in the last month or so around the Good Friday Agreement celebration, it seems there's a divide between people who thought that the Good Friday Agreement was a permanent settlement and that things would never change again, and then on the other side, people who thought it was the start of a process of permanent change. And how do you think those two can be brought together or made to work together?
Jarlath?
Thank you. It's a good question. How many amendments have there been to the United States Constitution? It's in the region of 30. I'm not sure how many passed, but your Constitution evolves continuously. Continuously. The United Kingdom Constitution, which is unwritten, but which exists in custom and practice and case law, is changed by key decisions taken by the Supreme Court or the Law Lords or the sovereignty of Parliament. The Good Friday Agreement was a constitutional provision for Northern Ireland. It led to a moment of national self-determination in Ireland, where Articles 2 and 3 of the Irish Constitution, which previously defined the territorial claim over Northern Ireland in terms purely of territory, that was amended to talk in terms of the firm will of the Irish nation being to unite the people in friendship and harmony. And then, subject to the principle of consent, which is that a majority in Northern Ireland wish it, to, at some point, consider uniting the island of Ireland in territorial terms. So constitutional evolution happens. It's an absolute part of human development. But the idea that the agreement was a trigger for constitutional revolution stands in the face of the content of the agreement itself. All parties who supported the agreement supported the amendment of Articles 2 and 3. The Irish Constitution is now critical and clear about the approach that the Irish people want, and it's to unite the people in friendship and harmony, and subject to consent, to consider then in a referendum on both sides of the border to unite the island. My own perspective is that the next period is one where we're looking at what I've referred to as a two states, one system approach. The two states are going to be in place for the next foreseeable period of time. Good sense, geopolitics, political expediency all demands, as does the agreement, that we work in much greater coordination on one system approaches, both within Northern Ireland, on the island of Ireland, and between Ireland and the UK.
Yeah, I think you may be referring to the fact that, like, crudely put, nationalists are always looking at events like the Good Friday Agreement or the Anglo-Irish before it as staging posts on an unfinished journey which ends with reunification, whereas unionists are always looking at things like the 10th of April 1998 as the final solution, or partition is the final solution, and we get on with life. And that's not realistic, because as Jarlath suggests, evolution and change is inevitable, and unionists need to get that into their head, because for centuries we've looked over our shoulders at Irish nationalists as the big threat to our constitutional position. Today, Irish nationalists barely make the podium behind Scottish nationalists, and the real threat is English nationalism. And if they start looking at the 15 billion odd that they send Northern Ireland every year and start thinking about how that could build an acute hospital in their constituency, put bobbies in their beat, and classroom assistants in their schools, then we could be in big trouble. And I'll put myself in trouble by being controversial. I think whatever the constitutional future holds, the least likely outcomes are the current status quo and the traditional 32-county single sovereign state. I think we're going to end up somewhere in between.
Thank you, Mike. Berna?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that, because there are other evolutionary things that need to happen. The demography in Northern Ireland has changed. There's no longer a majority and a minority. We're actually, and this was referred to earlier, multiple minorities. But clearly what is happening within Northern Ireland is also people who are not defining themselves as nationalists or unionists. And some of the things that are in the agreement in terms of decision-making mechanisms rely on, the old a nationalist unionist voting mechanism. And we're going to have to accommodate changes, for example, for the third party, which is much growing in numbers, and make it much diverse. Now, those kinds of things can be accommodated within the agreement. What is really important is that we don't use some of the fundamental principles that underpin the agreement, which is the nature of the relationships between the islands that have been referred to, the relationships between the people, the notion of consent, which belongs to the people of Northern Ireland and the people of the south of Ireland, and the principles around human rights, equality, and all of those issues. So I think we have to secure the principles, but things evolve and change.
I just wanted to say that, see, when we talk about implementation, I think this is where we dropped the ball in the last 25 years, because if you ask that question to anybody under the age of maybe 30, 35, they wouldn't even understand. Young people don't know the Good Friday Agreement, and I think if we're going to shine the spotlight on this year and then just leave it, then that's not good on us. How do we start to bring those values into the mindsets of children and young people? If we want this agreement to be as magical as what we say it is, then what are we going to do about it? Because at the moment, it stood in 1998, and it's done a lot, and I'm not disregarding that, but we need to work harder and try harder.
Thank you. You, sir, your question?
Thank you. Two quick and easy questions. Firstly, can you explain if there is or why there hasn't been a role for a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Northern Ireland, as there was in South Africa?
Quick and easy.
Yeah, quick and easy. Secondly, I'm really interested in what has been said so far about integration of education. What are the barriers to the integration of education? Why is that not happening in the North in the way that it has in this country, or tried to happen in this country? Thank you.
Shall we take integrated education first? This is quite slightly simpler. Do you want to take that, Emma?
I will, but this is probably my personal opinion, not Youth Action, the organisation I work for. I believe that in Northern Ireland, the role of the state and the church is still very much a big part of the system that exists. And it's an historic legacy that we've really found it difficult. So say the school that Derriger's based on, that was run by the nuns. And obviously in the other religion, there would have been input from from religious backgrounds as well. And I think that there's a bit of a stronghold that people are too afraid to question. And we do live quite conservatively in Northern Ireland. And I do think that our leadership maybe also holds on to conservative views because it's on it helps them as well. So I do think that this is why I talk about progressive politics. Progressive politics looks at LGBTQ+, it looks at reproductive rights, sexual health, and as we know, all of those things, as well as a religious aspect. And I think until we can start to unpick that, then things aren't going to change in terms of integrated education.
As a daughter of the segregated South and a former Consul General, I'll add just something of local context. This was one of my topics that I worked on passionately when I was Consul General. The polling when I was there, 2001 to 4, showed strong parental preference for an integrated education option. Parents wanted their children to have an option, but the default of the state is to fund a Catholic school and a Protestant school rather than an integrated school. I was told on my last trip back that there is legislation that passed and is getting implemented that the parental demand for integrated education is going to have to be respected. But it sort of blows your mind if you grew up in the South to think of parents asking for integration and the state blocking it. So I'll just offer that context.
If we go back to the formation of Northern Ireland, the first education minister wanted a single education system, and he was frustrated by vested interests, particularly the churches, and that's churches plural. Some people think it was just the Catholic Church. It wasn't. It was all the churches and the Orange Order. And why? Because they wanted to have influence and control over how children were brought up and how they thought. I would like to see a single education system, not because of the money, but it would save a shed load, but because if you start educating children together at age 4, you're giving them a virtual inoculation against sectarianism. In terms of dealing with the past, we simply haven't agreed politically, and we do focus almost exclusively as politicians on the lost lives And that is important, particularly for those who want truth and justice, or just even want the truth. But I was a victims commissioner before I went into politics. And my focus was on the lost opportunities of the living, because they have lost, so many people have lost opportunities in education, in employment, in health, particularly mental health, in family life, social inclusion. We can do things to help these living people. We can't help the dead, but we can help people who want to know, why did my loved one get killed? And if I was able to say, here's the framework we will do, that is the equivalent or instead of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, it would be about looking through the lens of human rights abuses. Because if we do that, nobody's got clean hands. And the truth is, nobody has clean hands.
So we're at just about 8:25 and a half, and we were supposed to stop at 8:25, and there's a reception going. We have not fully answered that really crucial question. We've got other people standing up. But shall we go ahead and stick to the timetable? Couple more. Does anybody want to answer straightforwardly the question, why hasn't there been a Truth and Reconciliation Commission? Mike went there. Jarlath?
It's because we tell too many lies about the past. That's it. And no, it is, and we're not honest about the past. We're not honest about our conflict. I want to build on Mike's point about human rights abuses. And I've thought about this an awful lot, when you come out of particular partisan positions in politics and you get time to reflect and you set aside the historical and the political and the colonial lines and all of those other lines that you can examine the past through, and you look at it through the prism of human dignity, you cannot but get to a common position that condemns utterly every aspect of our conflict from every part of our conflict. And that goes for the abuses in relation to things like job discrimination and so on, right through to destroying people's jobs through bombing city centres. And when you get to that point, that starts to change the argument. George Mitchell, when he was over, pointed out that 164 people have been murdered since 1998 in political violence or conflict-related type killings. The way our framework at present works, none of those are taken into account. The people murdered in Omagh in 1998, a few weeks after the Good Friday Agreement referendum result, that incident is not part of our past. It's post the agreement. So we need to have a different look at how we look at the past. And the other thing then, just building on the intergenerational issues, we have situations today where children who were not born at the time of the Good Friday Agreement are still suffering because of security tags, for example, unemployment against their parents or grandparents, because of visa issues against parents or grandparents. And those kind of things are things that we need to put into the package of the past as well.
Thank you. Sir, you've waited so patiently.
Thank you very much, Madam Consul General. My name is Jim Gaffey. I'd like to go beyond where we are with the Good Friday Agreement. What do we do next? And a new term has come to pass called a shared Ireland. Atlanta views Ireland as a whole, Northern Ireland as an entity that we want to help. Between 2004 and 2009, my company represented the Northern Ireland Chamber of Commerce and Industry in Atlanta. In 2004, we brought a shared trade mission to Atlanta. It was companies from Northern Ireland and companies from the Republic of Ireland. We looked upon that as a shared Ireland. I'd like to address first to MLA Nesbitt, what would a shared Ireland look like from a unionist perspective? And then I'd ask the other panelists to join in as they see fit.
I think the short answer would be it would look like we have properly implemented the North-South bodies, of which there are half a dozen, and the ones that I think are of most interest to me are the ones on tourism and the ones on the economy. But what would it look like? Well, for example, we're never going to build an acute hospital in Newry if the Republic's building an acute hospital in Dundalk, just a few miles away. And there is very good cooperation now on health, not least because of COVID. There has to be cooperation on climate change because it's not going to recognize the border. So I think the future is very sensible cooperation between the two jurisdictions. And we can max that out. We certainly haven't maxed out the cooperation in terms of the economy. I'm not afraid of an all-Ireland economy. Some unionists appear to think it's a bad idea. But as I said earlier, I'm about a prosperity agenda for all the people of Northern Ireland because I think that just is what the responsibility of a politician is ultimately, to keep people safe and to make sure they're feeling good about themselves, which is my definition of prosperity. It's not just about having a few quid in the back pocket. It's about having good mental health and enjoying your life.
Rona?
Yeah, it's said, and hopefully it works out in practice, that this new agreement, the Windsor Framework, will put Northern Ireland in a unique position to have access to both the UK market and the European market. And personally, I think that maybe the UK government may also be using it as a model to kind of reconfigure their relationships with the European Union as well. Because I think the disaster that Brexit's doing to the whole of the UK economy is vast. I would agree with Mike. I think we need to be building, it makes economic sense. One of the things that we are really concerned about is this visa issue coming into Northern Ireland, because the tourist industry is really, really concerned about it. Ireland is marketed as through the Irish Tourist Board and the Northern Ireland Tourist Board together. So are people going to fly in through Dublin and elsewhere and come north if they actually have to get a visa to come up to the north for a day or two? So that's one of the concerning issues that we need to address. So we need to be, so an all-island tourist market is obviously really sensible. And I mean, Ireland is good on the tech industry, north and south. We're good on the pharmaceutical industries, north and south. We could probably build up some of the research facilities around and more around production. But I would also make a plea of a very, very successful arts and culture sector on an all-island basis. And it's particularly exploded in Northern Ireland, and it's a very big economic generator, particularly, I mean, I don't have to tell you about the Game of Thrones and many other films that are now made there, and the same in the South. So there are all of those, and I think we, as Mike said, we need to come to rational decisions, whether it's integrating schools and saving money, and stop doing, if I build something in this area and we build something in another area, it's utter nonsense because it's a waste of money. Similarly, on both sides of the border, you know, whether it's a specialist hospital here or a specialist hospital there, we can share those resources. In fact, a DUP minister signed off on it in terms of children's services, because children from Northern Ireland were actually travelling to England, which was actually quite stressful, and arrangements were made for them to be serviced in a hospital in Dublin, which was much easier for families. So I think that's the way forward.
Wonderful. Sir.
Yes. So I'm kind of this as a 17-year-old, and knowing a lot of 17-year-olds, I've got two questions. The first is how, like, an average person in my position, Northern Ireland, Protestant or Catholic, Unionist or Republican, how much would this actually, like with the Good Friday Agreement and the Troubles, factor into their, how much they care about it? How much does it matter to them or their daily priorities? The second thing is, if they don't really care about it, how do you get them to care and appreciate something like the Good Friday Agreement and put that up high as a priority to prevent the mistakes in the past from being repeated?
We'll have Emma take that.
Great questions. Thank you so much. I suppose the first thing is that, in my experience of young people, they don't really know about the Good Friday Agreement. And that, if they do, it depends on whether their families have talked about it to them, not really because they've been taught about it at schools. So it's not something that comes up. However, they are feeling, like we've talked about, the impact of the legacy of the Troubles. We still have single identity communities, a lot of segregation within, and obviously within education, like we've talked about, that intergenerational trauma. And it's like, they're getting messages from people that are older than them, that people sometimes want to keep the agenda going in some ways. So what we try to do is positively engage young people, and not a need-to-know basis, but we don't need to be telling them about all the bad violence that took place. I mean, they get it, but what we try and do is move forward. So one of the things that we've done, which if you were in Northern Ireland, I would have got you to come, is we did 6 youth peace summits last year. And they were to inform a bigger peace summit that was happening this year for the Good Friday Agreement celebration. And we got young people from 6 areas of the north to come together and using youth work methodologies, so not sitting down, writing lectures. It was all done through group work and through reflection and dialogue. We got them to look at what the Good Friday Agreement is. We got them to look at how we can move forward. So we did it like creatively, using like randomly Lego and posters and workshops. And we give them the space to be able to say what was going on for them. So things like they care about were like climate change and climate justice and, LGBTQ+, and, having better housing and how to apply for university. So all those things that any young person cares about, Catholic and Protestant didn't come up at all. The protocol didn't come up at all. They don't even know what it is. The Windsor framework didn't come up at all. So see, my amazing 3 colleagues and friends, all of this chat that they talk, which is in some way alien to me, and I just be in all of them. This is all that we hear, though. No, like not in a bad way. Like young people, and it is very exclusionary to people that don't know. So through those peace summits, we talked about compassion, and we talked about, what do you want for you, and what do you want for your neighbour? What are your hopes and aspirations? What will a flourishing youth or Northern Ireland look like? But in saying that, we can't be tokenistic. So we had Ulster University, one of our biggest universities, who came to all the peace summits and was there with consent from the young people to write up the findings. So that's now being published. We worked in schools, but also worked with the young people that I mostly work with, who are the young people that Mike was talking about, that aren't working, that aren't in education, who are on the fringes. So we made sure that we had a really strong representation. So happy to share that with you when it's published in the next month or so. But that's one method that we use to engage. So keeping it real and relevant, that's what we need to do moving forward.
I think we should just say one thing, and I don't think we should be constantly saying this to young people because it would create a fear, but they're alive because of it, because some of the biggest casualties were young men, actually. So it's really important that we have the agreement, but it's really important that we hand it over to Emma and her peers, and they move it forward beyond us and others who are less positive than us, who still try to drag back. We are absolutely moving forward, and young people are definitely saying, we want something different, and they're also changing their voting patterns.
I'm not sure we're going to end on a better note than that. So I think we're going to probably have Rachel come up while we stay seated. Then I'm going to ask those of you who still have a question. There's going to be a reception afterwards. We'll keep our panelists together so you can actually ask your question up close and personal. Does that work? Sure. Great.
Thanks. Thank you. And to my colleagues who have written some wonderful closing remarks for me to make. At the end of the day, I'm standing between you and drink. And so I know this is not a crowd I should do that with, but thank you so much. This was a trip down memory lane for me. In 1993 to 96, I was actually the International Fund for Ireland desk officer at the Agency for International Development. So spent some time in Ireland and the border counties, and listening to each of your comments about where we've come from, where we're going, what the next generation needs to do to take on a peace process that adheres to human rights, that really takes a look back, but maybe not too far of a look back, because a Truth and Reconciliation Commission is perhaps, I think you answered that quite succinctly. And here at the Carter Center, we've spent 40 years, looking at issues of conflict. And I just remember in Northern Ireland walking in when Gerry Adams was invited in 1994 and going into the White House for an event and thinking, I was standing behind two men who were saying, well, we thought Israel-Palestine was hard, but if this is actually going to work in Northern Ireland, that really tells us something. So I think American exceptionalism aside, we have so much to learn from all of you. And as we really embrace this here, both at the Carter Center and our new U.S. domestic work and all the work that we do overseas on conflict resolution and human rights, this is an exciting handing over of the baton to the next generation after 25 years of a successful peace. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. Please make sure when you go out, you look at the peace heroine art. When I walked in and saw Monica McWilliams' face staring at me, I was amazed because I just finished reading her book. And really, there's so much in the story of the Northern Ireland Peace Agreement and the fact that President Carter spoke out about the region when he did 1977. It's remarkable to have you here so we can see how far we've come. So thank you very much, and thank you to Cuiva for your leadership in putting this together. We're thrilled to have you and to have Rachel and everyone join us. And both ambassadors, thank you for your work. So with that,